I'm sorry if I keep going off topic, but I grew up in the Catholic faith, where the ceremony of the Eucharist was every Sunday, and then went to the Pentecostal faith, which the Eucharist was twice a year, I think. So, as believers, when does the Eucharist come in?
During first century, we look at the scriptures and when Christ is doing it, he's like, do this in the remembrance of me, and it says actual Passover meal with his disciples. But even in the Roman culture, just that first century culture that they were in, bread and wine like represented a full meal. Like bread and wine represented the meal, not like just literally bread and wine. So they were supposed to dine together, and that was a lot of the first church did too. They weren't meeting in church buildings; they were meeting in homes and breaking bread. And it wasn't until like 400 A.D. that they created the Eucharist, and where they took it literal, where it's not representing a meal now; it's literally wine and bread. And because Jesus did something, it had to be something miraculous about it. They put a meaning behind it all, and even the Catholic Church, I grew up that way too, is like they believe that the Father is transferring something that's literally us consuming the body of Christ. And that was a new thing. That wasn't until centuries later that they started that. And it was a part of the kind of Gnosticism, and is when things were starting to creep into the Catholic Church. It was the first government-sponsored church, and they brought in a lot of their kind of pagan mystical rituals behind all that too.
So are you saying that the first century church did not practice the Eucharist?
Correct. That's what I think.
Yeah, they did Passover.
Yeah.
And they broke bread together on a regular basis.
And it was common to say a blessing for the wine and a blessing for the bread. So that's what you see in the scriptures, but it was not a formal practice until much later. Yeah.
In the first century, church believers would break bread together in their homes and their gatherings. But now when we created a church institution, they can't break bread and have meals together anymore, but they can have the Eucharist every Sunday or every week, or the Baptists might do it once a month, but they're all doing it in a way that's not representing the Passover meal anymore.
Yeah. I remember being confused when we first started practicing Shabbat, and we did the Friday night traditional lighting the candles, and we made challah, and we had the wine, and we would say the blessing. And then I was like, but wait, this bread is bread, like yeasted bread, and in the Catholic Church it's a little wafer, and so you start asking these questions because it's not all meshing together, and then you start asking the questions like, what is this that I'm doing? Then you start just looking at the history of it and how did it become what it is today and practiced by many Christian denominations. And I've had some negative experiences with the Eucharist, and one church wouldn't let me take it because I was not baptized in the Baptist church. I was baptized as a baby in the Catholic Church, and they literally would not let me. Like they literally said it. If you haven't been, and you start to question yourself. You're like, what?
Yep, they do it in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and so there is so much baggage wrapped around that idea that's so permeated the Christian faith.
Right, but that, from what I understand though, when Constantine, when it came up to 400 AD, what their attempt was, some communities were doing water and fish, and some were breaking bread and wine, and some didn't eat meat, so all this. So they're like, we have to do something consistent. And that's what they did. They made it a universal, consistent thing that now it's the Eucharist, bread and wine. And that was supposed to bring the whole universal church together. That's what the Catholic Church was. It was the universal church. Yeah. And they made it universal. Look at it today. It might be done differently, but every Protestant and Catholic religion does bread and wine Eucharist and not assigning it to the Passover meal. A very biblical thing that it was. But so I think Protestants are, to me, just protesting Catholics. They're all the same religion.
So the foundation of it was basically just the Passover meal. Not every Sabbath, just the Passover. And to acknowledge his sacrifice.
Yeah, I think most of us here essentially believe that Jesus was not instituting a
Bread and wine thing.
yeah, he wasn't instituting a sacrament like the Catholic Church
Eucharist.
started it, called it a sacrament, right? And a lot of Protestant churches still call it a sacrament. He wasn't instituting a new sacrament. He was blessing the bread and the wine at the Passover meal, which we do every year at Passover. It's definitely something worth stepping back and going, okay, so why don't you do this? But we also, because we have that understanding around it, we believe that the early church, when they got together, they broke bread together. That was an important part of communing with one another, of building community and fellowship.
And there's symbolism tied to the bread, the Lord being the bread of life. And like every Shabbat, if you have challah and you're eating bread and you say a blessing, just thanking the Lord for the bread, and we remember who Yeshua is as the bread of life, that's meaning that's there, but it's not a sacrament. It's a remembrance of who Yeshua is. Same with the wine. The wine, you say a blessing, but you're just blessing God and thanking him for, oh yes, this is symbolic, but it's not a holy sacrament.
So let's go back to Paul's writings when he was talking about them bringing the breads at their gathering. If he would have said, hey, this is a holy sacrament, y'all don't do this that way, this would have been when he would have brought it up. But instead he was talking about, how do we fellowship together as a community? We're breaking bread together and sharing what we have together as a community when we gather together. And
in addition to that, when we do Passover specifically, we do remember that Yeshua is our Passover. So that's a very unique, special time when we're like, when he says, do this in remembrance of me, that's how we understand that. Is like, we're remembering the Passover, that he is our Passover lamb.
I think what we call communion or the Eucharist now is a confusion of three different things.
Yeah.
First, it's Passover. When Yeshua was at the Last Supper, this was a Passover meal. And he says, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. Well, he's saying this being Passover. So whenever you break the bread and have the lamb or goat.
just hearing our portion.
In Jerusalem, of course, we can't do a lamb or a goat here for Passover.
But we still remember him.
Yeah, we can eat a lamb or a goat. We just can't do a lamb or goat sacrifice for Passover. The second thing is this word Eucharist. Frequently, people will say, well, you can look at first century Christian writings, and they were doing the Eucharist even then. Well, sure, but Eucharist just means Thanksgiving. They were doing a Thanksgiving meal. Every Shabbat, every time they gathered, they were having a meal. And they called it the Eucharist because they were giving thanks for what God had provided. It doesn't mean that they were doing a ritual meal with wine and bread and blood and flesh every time. And the third thing that they're confusing is that part of a sacrifice is eating the sacrifice. With almost all sacrifices, the people who brought it ate part of it, and the priest would eat part of it, depending on what kind of sacrifice. And so when Catholics do the Eucharist and they talk about transubstantiation and it becomes the body and blood of Christ, they are doing a sacrifice in the ancient pagan way of doing a sacrifice. And not just in the pagan way, but in God's religion, when you bring a sacrifice to the altar, you eat part of it, and the priest eats part of it. But that's always been part of sacrifice. And this is why Paul in 1 Corinthians and in Romans, he talks about eating meat sacrificed to idols, and why Yeshua in Revelation says that this is a terrible thing. Paul's argument was that as long as you're not participating in the sacrifice and you're not any part of that, then it's just meat. But if you're actually participating in the ritual, well, now you're eating meat sacrificed to idols, and now you're into pagan idolatry. And that's what the Eucharist is. It is the Catholic Eucharist. Now, I don't know if other branches of Christianity believe in transubstantiation. But once you get to that point, now you're participating in a pagan sacrifice.
Or what's the other one?
And at least this is my opinion, that should not be done. Now, if you go to a Christian church and they're doing communion, well, they don't believe in transubstantiation. I mean, non-Catholics, for the most part, they don't. They're just doing this ritual memorial thing, and that's not really a sacrifice. And whether you do that or not, I don't know. It's a gray area.
When we used to gather and we had some bread makers among us, like always on Shabbat, we would have bread. And I was just thinking as you were talking, I was like, oh, now I want to make bread for Shabbat when I get my bread meal, that would be fun to actually have it. Not because we're having the Lord's Supper, but just as
Breaking
a
bread.
representative of like what we're doing here and knowing that Yeshua says he's the bread of life.
When I used to make
Plus it
challah
tastes good.
every week, I would make a double loaf on Friday, and it was kind of like in remembrance of when God says to do a double portion on Friday so that you have enough for Saturday for Shabbat. And it's just a great visual. Like you're braiding the challah and you're all like got your 2 loaves and you got enough food for the next day and you're cooking enough and all of that. And it's kind of just a nice practice of a reminder. There's something nice about having that remembrance, but it's not a holy sacrament.
It was a part of us teaching our children Torah every week. We're setting this aside at Shabbat dinner. We're going to light a candle, setting it apart and making it special. But that's family tradition.
Right.
It's not biblical, and that's how you have to do it. It's not a requirement, but most of these traditions are lessons for our children.
They have significance in our lives if we don't elevate them above what God has said.
We don't get to define what's holy.